Hello and welcome to today's SQL Server maintenance webinar presentation. My name is Ray Cameron and I'm a part of the Extivia team. I'll introduce our presenter in just a moment. If you're new to Extivia, we offer a variety of enterprise technology solutions and services. Those solutions include database management and virtual DBA, business intelligence and data warehousing, application development, and portal development. You can find out more about our services at extivia.com. During today's presentation, Chris will be glad to address your questions as they come in or as they come up. So feel free to submit those at any time using the GoToWebinar control panel which should be on the right side of your screen. We'll also take a few minutes at the end to address any remaining questions. And now I'd like to introduce Chris Shaw, who started his database career in 1993 as a U.S. Marine. Thank you for your service, Chris, by the way. He is a SQL Server MVP, and he'll tell you a little bit more about himself. Chris, thank you for bringing this presentation to us today.
Thanks, Ray. I appreciate the opportunity. Before we get started, just kind of want to throw a couple things out there real quick. If you have a question, please don't hesitate to go ahead and throw it up in the chat box. It helps us move the presentation in a direction that's helpful for you. If there's something that's outstanding, or if it sounds like it's going to be a question that may take us a little bit longer, feel free to send me an email, I think on my second screen here. You'll see that, sorry, I got to wait for the screen to catch up with me. You'll see that there's going to be my email address. Feel free to drop it in, and we'll go in that direction. There we go. So I can be reached at cshaw@extivia.com. You can see all the relevant information there with my blog, what I'm active in. I work with the Colorado Springs SQL Server User Group. I'm a past regional mentor. And I've received the Microsoft SQL Server MVP Award 5 times now. But the most exciting thing I've done recently is joining the Extivia team. I work as a full-time virtual DBA, working a lot with the disaster recovery, tune-ups, doing that sort of thing, helping out people that might have some different issues. So hopefully you can see that there's some experience that comes through in this presentation. And you can see that you're not going to get just your standard books online type best practice recommendations. These are real life learned things that I've experienced, things that I've seen over the past 15 or so years. So where I really want to start with this is why we should do a tune-up or how you should look at a tune-up. Just like we had talked about in the abstract, a tune-up for your SQL Server is required, and it's just as important as doing a tune-up for SQL Server. It's going to give you the chance to be a lot more proactive and a lot less reactive. If you don't change the oil on your car, eventually your engine's going to go, and you're going to have to change the engine. Same thing with SQL Server. If you don't go through and perform regular maintenance, you're going to start seeing some different issues, things like running out of storage space, or your storage is taking longer to answer requests. Your servers are going to start to become vulnerable for different security risks. You may not be able to get a good handle on who's doing what. There's always the disaster recovery, the disaster planning issues that we have to be concerned about. We're seeing a lot in the news lately where you're seeing major problems all around the country, whether it be fires, snowstorms, floods, whatever the case may be. Your server needs to be ready to be moved so that you can continue with the business and the operations after you've addressed some simple things like your own personal safety and the safety of your family. Performance issues kind of relates back to the storage issues, but not necessarily 100%. You're going to start to see these performance issues. Things start to degrade. And unfortunately, with a lot of the technology and the way that people look at some of the Microsoft products today, is they believe that the answer is just rebooting the server. Well, in some situations, you could be losing a lot of valuable information if you just reboot the server every time you think the performance slows down. Doing these tune-ups gets you the information you need so that you can avoid these, or so that you can do the maintenance that you need to do off hours or at a different time. The other big question that comes up that I hear a lot is hey, we're getting ready to upgrade our SQL Server. We want to upgrade the hardware. We're considering, SQL Server 2012. They're starting to prepare for SQL Server 2014, which is on the horizon. Even operating systems, and people will continually ask, how much memory do I need? How much storage space do I need? During these tune-ups, if you do your documentation correctly, if you keep up on a lot of this information, these questions become real evident and present themselves immediately, and it's easy to stay on top of. The big reason that I really like to do a tune-up is it gives me a baseline to help for troubleshooting issues in the future. If someone were to come to me and say, Chris, hey, my performance on this query is running slow, or this machine isn't behaving like it should be. Sometimes there are situations where the SQL Server may be answering requests in a half a second or a tenth of a second, but that might be considered too slow for that individual application or that individual company or organization. I need to have a good idea on what the end result is. What's the total flow? How does this go all the way to the end user of the database? Do they see a half a second delay as a 3-second delay? Is a 3-second delay a long time? It may not be to some people, but in some situations, like a 911 operator, a 3-second delay could be a lot more than what they want to deal with at that point in time when they're trying to get emergency information over to people. So a quick overview on some of the things that we're going to touch base on. And we'll kind of jump into the meat here. Some of the questions that I get about this presentation is how often should people do tune-ups? And often they want me to come back and give them a firm number. They want me to say, oh, you need to do this once a quarter or once a month or once every 6 months. The end result is you need to do them on a regular basis. I would come back and I would present the question back to you and I would say, you know what, as long as you're doing them after you have some sort of a major change, whether it be a major upgrade, whether or not it be a release of a product that you're doing, new data imports, anytime you're doing something that's going to make an adjustment to your system and it's drastic, probably a good idea to do a quick tune-up. Make sure all the configurations are right, box is performing the way you want it to. At least then you can adjust your baseline and you can see what the performance looks like good. And then you have something to compare it to when the performance isn't as good as you'd like it to be. Another key thing about when you perform these tune-ups is you want to make sure you want to try to get as much of your operational time or the standard business hours as you can. Often we have to do as DBAs, we do a lot of work after hours. It takes a lot of time to do some of these maintenance tasks, re-indexing a database or upgrades or consistency checks. When you do these after hours, that it's done so that you're not impacting the customer. However, if you're doing a tune-up and you're trying to get a good idea of what the performance baselines are, some of these things you're going to want to do during your regular business day. I don't want to know what the server's doing when nobody's on it. I understand that the traffic is going to be less. But I'm going to see more problems, and the baseline becomes a lot more helpful if it's under normal operational mode or normal traffic. Good, if someone really still wants to hold me down, there's a couple references here, twice a year, once a quarter. It's really going to be up to you in what the traffic is on your machine and what you feel comfortable with. I wouldn't recommend going more than once a year. And you can see that there's the additional, even if you're monitoring your server, whether or not you're watching it with any number of third-party products, a lot of these third-party products are really heavy on your system, so that's even one thing to watch out for. Whether or not you're alerting on your systems, you need to make sure that you're still checking them. Don't count on your monitoring and your alerting to help you plan. The monitoring and the alerting is helping you to help notify you if there is an issue, not for long-term planning type of a situation. All right, so if we start at the bottom level or the bare metal level, and I guess you could even go lower than this if you want to start talking about looking at data centers, making sure that which probably isn't a bad idea to mention at this point. Don't forget to check things. If you have your own data center, if you're running your own server room in the back of your office somewhere, make sure your air conditioner is up and running. Make sure that if you have generated power, that the generator is being kicked on like it should, that it can take over the control of the power grid. Make sure that you have everything you need inside the server room in case there is a potential outage. It's interesting, some of the outages that I've done over the last year or so, some of the simplest things, some of the least expensive things end up being major problems. For example, I did an outage in a data center, I want to say 3-4 months ago, and we were really limited on the communication that we could have during the outage, and we couldn't communicate to the executives, we couldn't communicate to the customers because we didn't have a headset for cell phones located inside the server cage. When you're looking at IT, when you're looking at databases, you don't often think about, okay, well, I need to make sure that I have a headset for my cell phone with extra battery sitting in the cage. But when you start to take another look at it, you're going to realize pretty quickly that, you know what, if you can't communicate with everybody, there's going to be some issues. So as we start to talk about the hardware itself, go ahead and make sure that you run any sort of diagnostic tools that come with your hardware. I know that Dell has some of them, HP has some of them. I'm sure most of the hardware vendors have some sort of diagnostic tool that you can run. Do a physical check of your memory. Make sure that your processors are all working correctly. Make sure that your storage is nice and healthy. If you've got, it looks like we have a question here about SAN technology, and I'll address that here in a second. But you know, you want to make sure that you go through whether or not it's a SAN, whether or not it's the network fabric that sits between the SAN and the SQL Server, but any of the hardware that's there, make sure you run these diagnostics that are on them. Make sure that everything's up to the firmware, the most recent firmware. I'm not a big fan of just upgrading the firmware just because it's the most recent thing and you have to make sure that you push it. However, one of the things that I'm finding, especially with some of the SAN vendors or some of the storage vendors, if you're running into some sort of an issue and you need to jump on a tech support call, one of the very first questions they want to know is what firm level you're on. Wouldn't that make sense? But then the second question they ask is, you know, okay, why aren't you on the most recent firmware, and can we get you onto the most recent firmware? If you're left in a situation where you're in an outage, your database is down, customers are angry, the executive management staff wants to, you know, get some answers, and you're having to upgrade the firmware on, you know, multiple controllers and network switches and making sure everything's in place, it's not the time you want to be doing maintenance. You should be spending your time getting your databases back up and online. All of these things are good things to do, and it's great to have this information and to know that it's been done. But if you can't find the documents for it, if you can't show very quickly what sort of problems you had the last time you ran diagnostic tools, you don't know what the firmware is, you don't know what the most recent configuration is, you're probably going to be left in a situation where you're going to be spending time researching that. Make sure you document all this stuff. If you're not documenting it, it's going to just, you know, eliminate some of the issues that are there. It looks like we have a question. Are there special considerations if your SQL Server instance is on a VM residing on a SAN? That's a good question. Virtual machines, the way that the virtual machine maintenance works is some of the considerations. I think a lot of it depends on what kind of virtualization tool you're using, whether it's Hyper-V, VMware, whether or not you can move them back and forth. I'm not sure that there's any specific maintenance that is just isolated to the virtual machine. That's an interesting question. I'm going to take note of that, and if I can, I'll do some research on it. If I can come up with something, I'll put together a blog on it. That's interesting. Nothing comes to mind. Gosh, probably not a very good answer. Make sure.
Chris, we do have contact information for all our attendees too, so if there's something that comes up after and you want to expand on that, we can surely give that contact information to
awesome.
Answer him directly.
Is there, hey Ray, while you're here, and I'm sorry to do this, oh, there we go. I was having a hard time getting the question box to the point where it's big enough where I could see it.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But I got it.
Great.
So. All right, let's go ahead to the next slide. Once you're done with the hardware or the metal level, it's time to start looking at your operating systems. There's a number of maintenance items for the operating systems that you should complete. Obviously, the same holds true for the operating system as it does for the hardware as far as the patches. Granted, we don't have the firmware, but we have the patches. We need to make sure that's up to date. I guess all of your drivers are relevant. One of the things that I think DBAs miss a lot of is reviewing some of the operating system logs, your application logs, your system logs. I don't think those get checked often enough. It's something that can be automated to alert you in situations where there's entries that you're not expecting. I think that's one thing that's just not applied often enough. Reading and reviewing these logs often become a very tedious task, and if you're not automating aspects of it, you're missing a lot. Another common thing that you'll see with operating systems and databases, I guess more third-party application type stuff, is what sort of virus protection tool that you're running. There's a lot of different debates out there about whether or not you should be running virus scanners on SQL servers. If you do, are you scanning your database files? Are you looking at your MDS, your LDS, your log files, your backup files? If you're seeing some performance issues and you have some virus protection that's on there, make sure you're not scanning those. It's creating a lot of additional I/O that you don't need. Check your local administrators group that's on that operating system, especially if you have a SQL server that allows those local admins into the box and gives them full control. Make sure that you know who's still there. You know the people that are in the group. You know the people that shouldn't be in the group. It's never a bad idea to check with HR to say, you know what, hey, we've got these people with elevated security. Should we be looking at whether or not they have, we should be removing those accounts? Are they still with the company? Is there any issues there? Do you have any other applications that are installed on the machine that shouldn't be there? You'll find this a lot on smaller companies where multiple people have access to the database servers, that often they need to find some storage. You've got somebody from the marketing department or from the sales department or HR or whatever the case may be, and they need to find a big storage area, and they start surfing around the network and, oh wow, look, this database server has this huge 200 gig area that I can put all my MP3 files. That's probably not the place for them. You don't want to steal storage away from your database. It's probably not optimized as a file server. So you need to make sure that you're checking that there's not stuff there that shouldn't be there. If you are on a clustered system, there's a couple additional things that you might want to take note of. Make sure that you run a failover test. Make sure that you fail that cluster over on occasion. Once a month is probably sufficient. I know people that do it once a week, or organizations. I know people that don't do it nearly once a month. But a failover, the way the cluster services are built, your cluster failover shouldn't take that long. So as long as you have some scheduled maintenance, it gives you an opportunity to make sure that your immediate HA type systems are there and are still operational. The other interesting thing that I find is that when you move things from, one of the other reasons you want to move things from node to node is to make sure that both of the nodes perform well. Nothing is worse when you're in a disaster situation, you're trying to recover some things, and then all of a sudden you look up and the secondary node, which is supposed to protect you, doesn't perform as well because configurations don't match, or because the firmware wasn't up to date, or whatever the case may be. Make sure you back up that quorum information. You want to make sure that all these things can be rebuilt with the configurations that you have. Verify all the services are on the physical nodes that you want them to be on. Don't be running your agent on one node or your MSDTC service on one node and running your engine on the other node. Make sure that everything's exactly where you expect it to be. There hasn't been any failovers. Check those logs. Make sure that you're seeing Is there a failover? We talked about the performance on the different nodes. The other thing is just take a quick look at the dependencies. Make sure that the dependencies are accurate. We did a quick story. I was working on a system not too long ago where they were replacing the SAN. And the migration path was, bring up a new SAN, slowly move the drives and the databases, and then once we were done, start deleting the ones for the old databases. Well, the problem was is as soon as we deleted one of those LUNs, we hadn't taken the steps to verify the dependencies of SQL Server on that LUN. And so once the LUN that was no longer being used was removed from the operating system, the cluster dependency was still there, and the SQL Server didn't think too highly of that. So we were able to diagnose it quickly, but it was one of those things that we had to do that we weren't expecting. Let me jump on here and take another look at the questions. I noticed that when you would normally segregate your drives, data log, temp, backups, etc., then it might be a moot point as far as the spindles, although you have drive space divided up on the SAN. Sorry, I'm kind of cutting the question short because you do have drive space.
Chris, it looks like the bottom line on this one is one of our attendees having a hard time coming to terms with SQL Server on a VMware instance on a SAN. The rest of the question kind of explains that in more detail.
Oh, I gotcha. Okay. So this question is from Fred. Fred, I've got a number of SQL servers that I'm running on not just Hyper-V but VMware as well. There are some considerations. There's some things that you need to look at. However, I do think that these virtualization techniques are production ready. It looks like you have some pretty in-depth questions here as I'm kind of going through it. It looks like you had a follow-up that talks about log shipping, mirroring, and clustering if your second server is a VM on the same SAN. Fred, you're spot on. Some of these things that are designed for redundancy. So, and I think you had a really good question. You buy clusters and you put in Windows clustering and SQL Server on top of that cluster to protect you from the hardware, right? But if you're putting it on a VM and if you can't move that VM from one physical node to the other node, but you still make it a cluster, you're kind of removing some of the redundancy that's there. I see you follow the train of thought going through the log shipping and mirroring and the whole 9 yards. This would be a great discussion for afterwards, Fred, like you'd mentioned. If you're okay with it, I'll send you an email if we've got that email address, or feel free to send me an email, and we'll kind of dive deeper into the question. It's really good. There are protection things that you need to do. VMware's got the vMotion. If you're going to mirror, you're going to want to make sure that you're mirroring to a different set of storage. Don't mirror to the same set of storage because, well, you're right. You're spot on. It's not buying you some of the redundancy that you want. However, it is going to get you some of the information, some of the protection. The key factors here are making sure that you understand and that the organization understands what the limitations are and what's not there and what is. Like I said, we'll follow up afterwards, and hopefully we can dive a little bit more into this.
Chris, while we've had a couple questions from Fred, and just want to let the rest of the audience know we're glad to take these throughout the webinar. I also want to note a couple things. We are recording this, and the webinar will be available after. We'll take about a day to process it, and it'll be available on the website. The second thing is Chris has been generous enough to provide some contact information. So before we wrap up, you'll see that. And if you've got more specific questions too, you can address those to him as he provides that contact information.
Thanks, Ray. Okay, so let's jump into the third-party software type area. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. If you're not familiar with the backup compression software that's out there, there's a number of tools out there, whether it's backup compression, whether or not it's disk performance measurement tools. There's so many third-party tools that are out there. You got to make sure that these get the same tune-up that everything else does. Make sure that you've got all the legitimate copies that you need of the software and the versions. There's nothing that's going to, create a bigger problem for you If you're trying to get a log that was created by a version of a third-party tool that went out of date 2 years ago. So make sure that you have all the versions, keep them, make sure that you document what's being done where, make sure that you have your support. If you're still using the tool, keep it licensed, keep your point of contacts, know who you need to talk to in case there is a problem, and it's going to help save you a lot of problems. All right, if we're ready, we'll jump into the SQL Server portion of the tune-up now. There's a number of things that you can do on the SQL Server side that you can either automate or you can do via script. Unfortunately, because of the time constraints that we have today, we can't go through a lot of these, but you may hear me mention a couple of them. We can make notes, or we can touch base on these later. I think one of the key things that you need to make sure that you're doing when you're doing tune-ups on your servers is document your configurations. Know where that your system catalogs are stored. Know where the files are for your MDF files, where are those being stored, your LDF files, who has what security levels. There's tons of pieces of information that if you get into a situation where you're troubleshooting, you need to know what the configurations are. You need to know what the memory has been configured like. If you have to recover the master database, you need to know where those files were stored, what the locations were, what some of the startup parameters were. If you have this information handy and you're not storing it in the database that you're currently managing, then you're going to have a much better opportunity and increase your chances of success, whatever those challenges may be. We talked about reviewing the error logs on the operating side. You've got the same thing on the SQL Server side. Make sure you check the SQL Server engine log. Make sure you're checking your agents. The SQL Server agent log. We already talked about the Windows log. Another one that I think is really important that we look over is that your maintenance plans. A lot of companies put these maintenance plans into place because they're easy. They meet the needs of 80–90% of the SQL Server installs that are out there. So why go through and customize them? But if your maintenance plans start failing, sometimes those error messages aren't very helpful. You want to make sure that you're reviewing those logs. You're going through, making sure that you're getting rid of the ones you don't need anymore. Now that we're talking about maintenance and on maintenance plans in general, there's certain maintenance items that you need to ensure that are being done on your database on a regular basis. Are you indexing frequently? Are you indexing the tables that have a lot of changes being done to them? Are you indexing static tables only? Are you indexing everything? Having a good indexing strategy is going to drastically impact how your maintenance is impacting the server and when it's being done. Kind of back to Fred's question earlier, when you start looking at mirroring or you start looking at transaction log shipping or some of these other kinds of technologies, if you're creating index or if you're rebuilding indexes on indexes that don't need it, then you're making your file sizes much bigger than what you need, which means that that's all going across the network. It's all having to be backed up somewhere else. It's going from machine to machine. It's taking a processing time. Follow up on your indexing. Make sure that you understand how this is all fitting together. Backups, very much the same way. Recently presented with the question on should we consider doing differential backups rather than doing a full backup every night? Absolutely. There's a number of benefits to doing a differential backup, Monday through Saturday, and then doing a full backup on Sunday night. Network, the amount of data you're sending across the network is just one of many, many benefits. Make sure you're checking the consistency of your database. The DBCC check DB commands, the check table commands, these are going to start to alert you to errors before other aspects of SQL Server or the client starts to recognize them. You don't want your database to go offline, be marked suspect, and be surprised by these things. Take the opportunity to fix issues when you can before they become a problem, and you don't have to worry about whether or not you're stopping all your production systems. Your statistics on your tables and your indexes, this information drastically can impact how the queries are running, whether it's stored procedures, ad hoc queries, query plans, the whole 9 yards. These statistics, if you're not maintaining them and keeping them up to date, they can start to go by the wayside. You have query plans that are being built off bad information, And if that bad information is just going to lead you to more performance problems down the road. Sorry if I'm speaking a little quick. I want to make sure that we get through all the slides today and we get all this information. Looks like Randy had a question here. Can I provide a best practice article or white paper on maintenance plan that provides good samples on how to set up a maintenance plan? Wow. Randy, that's some great information there. I'm going to take that one off to the side, Randy, because I don't know of one that's right off the top of my head. One of my peers does a really good session on maintenance plans. Maybe we can get that done up on a webinar. If not, maybe I can put something together. The best practice is kind of tricky on that because every environment's different and all of these different requirements. But you know, things like if you're making sure your index, if you're doing the indexing, if your data is not static, make sure you're doing your backups, your consistency checks, your statistics, that sort of thing. That's going to give you the basic needs that you have covered, and then making sure you go through each one of these to customize them for your environment. That's going to be really big. I hate to leave you with the same answer of, we can touch base with this offline, but for the most part, Randy, everything is so specific to an environment, so coming up with the best practices is really kind of difficult. Hey, Ray, does this automatically put all the questions at the bottom? It does. Never mind.
Yep, it does. You're right.
So when we talk about, and Randy, maybe this is going to get, Randy, let me know if, or post another question later after we talk about some of the other maintenance type items that we have here. And let me know if this isn't good enough information, if you want to go deeper, and then we can go from there. Like we had talked about, you need to make sure that your backups are there. A best practice for Randy, a backup isn't doing you much good unless you can restore from it. If when I'm speaking at some of these national events, if I'm at the passive interconnections, it's funny, often I will mention that if there's a database that can't be restored, there's probably a DBA somewhere who's losing their job. The end result is that as a DBA, our primary responsibility to the organization is to make sure that database is recoverable. Now, there are situations where companies will put the DBAs in a position where you can't recover it, but it's also our responsibility to make sure that everybody understands this is what you need to do to make sure your database can be recovered, and this is what your RTO and your RPO are, your recovery time objectives and your recovery point objectives. If you don't know how much data you could potentially lose by your backup plan, you don't have enough information. I don't know if there's a clearer way to say it. I don't know if I can stress the point enough, but organizations need to understand what the risk is before they start making firm decisions on this is the way we're going to back up your database. Backup designs start with the restore. Sorry, go on here. I get all emotional because it's something that means a lot to me. So when you're doing your tune-up, make sure that you're getting those backups as you expected. It's not a bad idea to go over things like what your recovery time objective is, which is how long does it take to get the server back online. If something catastrophic were to happen, how long does it take to restore it? How long does it take to go all the way back to, okay, we have a backup file that's located off-site, but if that's 45 miles away and it's an hour drive through traffic, is that going to be sufficient? Is it going to be okay if you're down that amount of time, and then by the time the tape gets to you, you have to turn around and restore the database? Lots of information here. The best way that we can look at this, the best way, the key thing that you might, as a DBA or as an organization, need to keep in mind, test how long it takes to restore your database. If you don't know, have a meeting today. Go sit down with somebody on the staff, whether it's your DBA, whether or not it's your Windows administrator, and you need to tell them, we need to get a copy of the database up and running from our off-site storage, and we need to do it as quickly as possible. That's what you're trying to do, is to recover from an outage. If you don't know what this time is, it's absolutely critical to do this. Are you backing up all the files? It's one thing to be able to say, okay, well, I can restore this database and this database, but are you getting your keys? Are you getting SQL Server Reporting Services? Are you getting that configuration, their certificate keys? What about the system catalogs? SQL Server, I believe in 2005, if I'm going off the top of my head, introduced CLR. And those CLR files, those DLLs, which may be sitting in the operating system somewhere, are those being backed up? If not, are they at least in your oh gosh, it's escaped me, your file storage where you keep versioning of your software, source control, or your batch files being done? Do you document all of your different backup facts that you have? Just like we had talked about with the restore testing, you need to be able to go through and say, hey, where is this being backed up to? Am I taking this off-site? Are we taking this across the network? How often do we do it? How long do we keep it? Retention period is a huge thing right now in the industry because there's some attorneys that are actually out there telling companies if the data is more than X amount of time, get rid of it. You don't want to legally be liable to have data that long. Now, don't make any sort of decisions based on how I'm recommending it. That's something that's relevant to your database and to your organization. Something you definitely need to verify is how far back you need to be able to go. Lots of information on the backups. Let's take a quick look at some of the security information. Just the basics here. Are you changing your passwords? Have you changed the SA password recently? Are you documenting these passwords? If so, are you documenting them on a yellow sticky note that's stuck to the front of your computer? What's really interesting is, if you don't believe me, the next time you go into different office buildings, let's say you go to your dentist or the doctor or wherever the case may be, take a look at the computer monitor and see how many yellow sticky notes have passwords written on them. That's not the obvious place. That's not the place you want to put your SA password. This is your system's administrator password. It has ability to do everything on your database. It needs to be in a secure location. As a matter of fact, I recommend that once you change that password, it gets put into an envelope, written down, stick it in a safe, and don't ever use it again until you're resetting it. You can create the privileges to the accounts that need it in a different area without having the direct SA password. Another thing you might want to keep an eye out for is look at some of the linked servers. Verify that you know who has access to these linked servers, whether or not they're being impersonated, whether or not they're logging on as SA as they go across that link. It's a huge security risk if you're not paying attention to it and not understanding what you're needing. One of the key things, it's always difficult for me to translate or to tell people how important some of these things are. So a good example is you got to consider that all of your personal information, your Social Security number, how much money you make, how much vacation time you have, your insurance, your medical information is probably stored in an HR database. If it's on a different server than your production system, does your production system link into it? And if it does link into it, can anybody who has access to, let's say your reporting server, anybody who have access to your reporting server, can they run and get that information on you? If your information, if you don't feel comfortable that your information is personally safe, then is it safe enough for your customers? It's a critical point today in the society and the way that the environment is nowadays. You've got to stay on top of the security. We talked a little bit earlier about making sure with HR that who's still employed, who's not employed, what accounts need to be removed. It's probably not a bad idea that if HR has a checklist that when an employee separates for whatever reason, that IT were to be notified so they could shut down the accounts. Well, your database staff should be as well. Check for any shared account access. This one's really interesting. You're going to see this a lot pop up on audits more and more often, like the Sarbanes-Oxley, your ISO audits, PCI compliancy. If you're seeing a lot of shared access where we're going to say, okay, the reporting department has the account reports, and the password is password 123. Does everybody have access to that? Is it being shared with everybody in the company? I worked at an organization one time where we would have to go through the stringent change the SA password policy we had to go and share the SA password with one group, and it wasn't a day after we shared the password with that group that everybody in the company now had the new SA password. That's not secure. It's not secure that if everybody knows what the password is, because at the point where everybody knows where it is, why take the risk of changing the password and breaking existing applications that might be using that? In the case of SA, you shouldn't be using that, but that's a whole different discussion altogether. Let's see here. How are we doing on questions? So far, so good. A couple of the other security things that I wanted to mention is make sure you're checking your Active Directory. We talked earlier about Windows, making sure your local groups, your local accounts, who has access to what. You're going to want to check to make sure who can log on to your server. Check the master database. Look to see who has logon privileges. There's some scripts that you can run. A peer of mine, David, has a really neat script that we've been working with lately that'll compare passwords to, I think it's the 25 most popular passwords that are out there. That's just what, just the simple fact that if the password matches one of those 25 most popular passwords, then obviously there's a security risk that's there. Who has remote desktop access? Who can get in, who can log on to the machine? Who has the ability to copy things to and from your backup drives, your data drives? Is your data drive even shared? Any sort of these sharings that are being done on your physical disks could pose a security risk to you. If you have Enterprise Edition, and depending on the version of SQL Server you have, SQL Server Audit is an awesome way to keep track of some of these access methods, some of the things that are being looked at, some of the people who are making changes, whether or not objects are being deleted. And I highly recommend that you consider using the SQL Server Audit functionality with SQL Server. There's even scripts out there. There's even standard auditing best practices that you can go out there and grab, and you can say, hey, okay, we want to audit a PCI compliant machine. We want to audit a machine that is super sensitive for HIPAA. And you can take these best practices, put this inside your SQL Server audit, and already have something generated that's auditing your server. And you can say, hey, the next time you're audited, here's all my information. You can give it to them. You're right there, good to go. Policy-based management. This is another one that's awesome to check, and it's awesome to use if you have that functionality, if it's there for you. I can't recommend these tools enough. I don't know why this isn't clicking through my slides. There we go, as fast as I like them to. Just a couple quick bullet points on disaster recovery. We want to make sure there is a plan. I do a whole session on disaster recovery and what some of the disaster recovery options are. Myself personally, it's one of the areas that I really like to focus my career on, working with all the new technologies, whether it be always on, some of the deprecated features like mirroring, transaction log shipping, and not necessarily replication. I like working with replication, but not in a DR type sense. There's tremendous amounts of or options that you have to set up some sort of disaster recovery plan. But if you have no plan, none of them are going to work for you. And you really need to make sure that you can go through and you have an idea of, okay, can we recover from a disaster? What level of a disaster? Is it a site outage? Is it a server outage? Is it a piece of hardware like a power supply going bad? There's so many different potentials that are out there that if you don't have a plan, and you're just not going to be able to recover from some of these things. So the important critical key points is making sure you have a plan. Make sure that plan isn't stored on the server that you may potentially be restoring. Obviously, if it goes away with the rest of your other software, your other documentation, that's not very helpful. Print hard copies of your plan. Make sure there's multiple copies of your plan. Probably not a bad idea to put a copy of your plan inside your storage bin if you've got off-site storage. Make sure you keep your plan updated. And the plan, in my opinion, isn't any good until you've tested it. Can you do a disaster recovery? Can you take your database and put it in a different facility 20 miles away or on the other side of the country. How long is it going to take you to do that? Have you done an end-to-end test knowing, okay, all of these applications and their connection strings need to be moved? Knowing, here's some of the gotchas. We need to alter this DNS. Understand there is a huge difference between a disaster recovery plan, or otherwise called a DRP, and a BCP plan, which is a business continuation plan or continuity plan. The BCP is more designed towards the organization. It includes phones, it includes power, it includes people movement. How are you going to get people from one facility to another facility? A DR plan, this is SQL Server focused. This is IT focused. Get a DR plan that's focused towards your SQL Server. Make sure that you know how to take care of the aspects that you're responsible for. Fred says, kind of going back to the last slide, we were talking about policy-based management, I think. Is it either or with PBM? Yes, it is. There's a lot more information with policy-based management. I'm not sure, Fred, if you're referring to like groups, like security policies, or if you're referring to policy-based management. Fred, we're going to touch base later. Make sure that you remind me of that, and we'll definitely touch base on that as well. Your SQL Server jobs. Your SQL Server agent is responsible for putting all of these jobs in place, making sure that they run, the history of them, keeping good management on there, making sure that they're not colliding. It's always a good idea to check to make sure that all your jobs are still running that are expected. Are they enabled? Have they been disabled? If they are, why are they disabled? One thing that always kind of surprises me is that there's not a description in the jobs. You know, right there on when you create the job, you have the opportunity to create a description for it. Put some information in there. Tell me who's responsible for the job. Is it a temporary job that you're doing it just to fix some bugs that were there in the database beforehand? Is it something that's needed long term? Is it to help, you know, do this task or that task on your data? Check to see who the ownership of that job is. If it's a Windows account, you know, is it the appropriate Windows account? Is it a service account? Is it a systems administrator account? Check to see what your average run times are. It's really interesting how, if you talk to a lot of DBAs, they can tell you, oh yeah, it takes about an hour for my database to back up, or it takes about 5 minutes for my database to back up. If you don't have a good average runtime, or even if you do think that you have the good average runtime, it doesn't hurt to go in there and double check and say, okay, over the last 30 days, what was the average runtime that it took for my backup job to complete? If you're seeing, and then document it, and if you're seeing that time, that duration grow, then maybe there's something that you need to look into. If it's shrinking drastically, maybe there's something you need to be looking into as well. What you can pull from statistical information like average runtime, max runtime, shortest runtime, is going to be able to present you with the opportunity to do a lot of research and to get things solved before they could become a potential problem. Job collisions are another thing that you should be reviewing. That's when you have two jobs running at the same time that could be competing for different resources or the same resource, whether the resource is a database, disk drive, memory, processors, whatever the case may be. You want to make sure that your jobs are timed appropriately and that they're not impacting things like the production or the standard day-to-day operations of it. When a job fails, are you getting notified of it? Do you have alerts set up? Do you have a lot of operators configured? Your SQL Server can send you these notifications and let you know, we've had a job fail. We've had, it's failed because of this reason or that reason. Your backup plans have failed, which obviously get scheduled as jobs. There's a number of different things that you can be alerted to, and SQL Agent Service can take care of a lot of these for you. But you got to stay on top of them. Make sure that they're there. One interesting, as we're talking about notifications for the job, I see often where organizations will go through and they'll say, send me an email anytime this job fires. It's a backup job that runs every night. And they'll say, send me an email every time that this is successful or if it fails. I'm not a big fan of being reported on things that are successful. I think that people get used to seeing emails And you kind of do like the autofill when you see these emails. Oh, database backed up successfully. And then when you see one that successfully, it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. If you're only getting notified by failures or alarms, and if the process of checking that is not automated, you have a big, in my opinion, I think there's a big risk of missing something that you shouldn't be. If we go down into the individual database level, you might want to take a double check to make sure that your auto grow is at the size that you want it to be at. It's growing whether or not it's by percentage or by a specific set size. SQL Server will give you to adjust that so you can customize it as much as you'd like it to. However, it may not be a good idea to grow a petabyte database by 10%. That's going to be quite a huge growth pattern that's going to create some contention on your storage. However, if you've got a database that's really large, let's say 100 gigabytes, and you want to grow by 10%, it's not going to impact as much as the previous example. Make sure your recovery models are set appropriately. If you've got a simple recovery model, but you're expecting that your database be able to be restored up to 5 minutes before an outage, might be something that we need to take a look at maintenance plan-wise to make sure you're backing up appropriately. The recovery model is dictating how your database can be recovered based on how the transactions are stored in the transaction log and can be recovered if you have a backup of them. We talked about, I made another bullet point of making sure you're backed up. Auto shrink, auto close, are you using these feature sets, and do you understand completely what they are? Has somebody gone in while you were on vacation and said, oh, this database is taking up too much space? Oh, look, we've got this auto shrink method. Let's check that. The fragmentation that it causes, all internal to the database, which you'll see plenty of documentation online for. Not to mention the actual shrink process itself, which randomly kicks off every, I think it's 6 hours now. And it doesn't matter if your server's busy or not. Boom, there goes the auto shrink. Everything's going to hold up while it's finishing. Do you have enough storage space? So do your databases have the growth? Are you watching the growth patterns of your database? Is that storage going to keep up with it? We looked at the total footprint size. Inside the free space versus the total footprint, the files, if you're only looking at the files that show on the storage, then you may have a ton of free space in there that's allocated to the database that you may not need. If at the same time, if you're doing that, they may throw off all your growth patterns and some of the forecasting we've done earlier. Make sure you document these file sizes. Make sure that you know how much free space is in there and that you can understand that there's a difference between what's free internal to the storage and what's free internal to the database. Some of the baseline information, really key to doing a tune-up on your SQL Server. Make sure you get a baseline. Know run a performance monitor on your system and know the key performance indicators. What are your memory looking like? What is your page file usage inside that memory? Do you have enough available megabytes of memory so in case SQL Server needs more? Is your memory even configured on the SQL Server correctly? Is it leaving enough memory to the operating system? How about your storage? Is your storage fabric configured the right way? If you're using iSCSI, you make sure that all your network configuration inside that private network behind, or hopefully private, is configured correctly for optimal throughput to and from the storage. Understand where that bottleneck is. Your processor utilization, whether or not the processors are doing a lot of switching back and forth in context. Looking at things that may be a higher priority in thread, or maybe going back and forth between the OS and SQL Server. Networking, we talked a little bit about with the storage fabric, but that goes through the same, whether or not the SQL Server, the physical hardware, can get out to the internet, or is it behind a firewall? Is it sectioned off on a subnet? What can it talk to? Understanding all of these baselines, and when you're talking about baselines in particular, is what is that network utilization? How much traffic are you putting over there? A blog that hopefully you'll be seeing coming from me really soon is locking and blocking. Often people think that locking and blocking are a bad thing on the SQL Server. In reality, they're not. This is what holds your integrity of your database. And even if it is extended blocking, if things are being blocked for much longer than what you would want them to be, maybe it's holding it because it's trying to protect you. It's trying to correct some things. Understanding what your locking and blocking looks like on a regular basis is going to give you a huge insight on whether or not you're having a blocking problem, or maybe potentially even to a point where you might be seeing some deadlocking issues. Looking at the lock wait times or the wait times in general are going to give you a good piece of information on what the health and the performance of your SQL Server is. I always like to take my performance counters, like my processor utilization, or the available free megabytes of memory, or the storage I/O counters, my IOPS, which any of these performance you like to look at, and there's a number of them. As long as you're getting the key ones, and we kind of go back, make sure you're getting stuff for your memory, your storage, and your processors. Network is really good, but it's not necessarily as critical. Same with your locks. If you've got a busy SQL Server, you need to have that. These are your major areas that you want to get them in. I know everybody can see me pointing my finger at my screen. That's the negative of doing webinars. However, those pieces of information, for them to be relevant to the organization or to the company, needs to have some sort of reference point to them. A reference point being, this is how many people are connected to the SQL Server. On a regular basis, we have 300 connections that are being made to the SQL Server. And when we have 300 people connected to the SQL Server, we run a processor utilization at 60% or at 50%, whatever the percentage is. If I can give you those two pieces of information, it references each other, and it gives you the opportunity to say, oh, wow, look, our processor utilization just jumped up to 90%. Let's take a look at how many users are connected. Are we seeing more, or are we seeing less? Are we seeing the same? It's going to help give you a point of reference to do some research in the future. Your page filing, or how much you're paging, your cache hit ratio. There's so many accounts inside your performance monitor you can look at. I've got a standard set that I use. Many of them we talked about a little bit before. There's a number of them out there on the internet. The key point in this is you've got to make sure that you're consistent, grabbing all the same counters all the time if you want to use these for troubleshooting, and you need to understand what the counters are actually measuring. Sometimes the counters don't measure exactly what you think they do, and it can be an advanced subject to kind of jump into there for a little bit. Trying to find out, looking for a clock here.
Hey, Chris, we're just about 2 minutes away from the top of the hour.
All right. Thank you. Some other things to kind of wrap up here is make sure that you get your baselines from different times of the day, different days of the week. Make sure that you're getting them over holidays. Make sure that you're getting them over long weekends, the whole 9 yards. And we talk again about having something measurable or a reference number too. When you start talking about the performance aspect, you still may want to get a trace file through your SQL Server Profiler, potentially some of the extended events to see whether or not wait times, anything there that's, or not wait times, but any extended event things that you may want to measure down the road. Get an end user perspective. Go sit with the people who are the end users, whether it's customer service inside your building, whether or not it's a customer on the other side of the internet. Get an understanding of what they think the performance is like. Kind of made a quick reference here too on how you can do some selection between what you should be tuning. That'll be in the slide deck, which will be, you can download a little bit later. We did have a discussion about indexes earlier when we were talking about maintenance plans. Just make sure that you can use this as a reference again. The index tuning advisor is there. That's a good opportunity for you to kind of get a quick jump on it if indexing is not your favorite things to do. We talked about alerts and some of the things that you can watch with your alerts as far as how it relates back to your SQL Server agents. These are a number of the items here that you can alert on. We can cover that. As we wrap up, I want to make sure that we kind of touch base on some of the things and bring this full circle. You don't take care of your car, it's going to break. If you don't change oil, it's going to blow up. You don't change the brakes on your car, eventually you're not going to be able to stop. SQL Server has these same issues. You don't take care of the SQL Server, you don't maintain it, it's going to slow down. It's going to crash, and it's going to have problems. The only question you need to ask yourself if you're not doing a tune-up, is what's the time difference between your server being healthy and when the server is offline. If you're confident that you can rebuild your SQL Server fast enough, then you know there's some other considerations that you should be looking at. But if you're going to have a good, healthy server, you want to keep it online in some sort of a mission-critical type of a format or an operations, you need to make sure you're performing maintenance on them. It's just going to help you in the long run. I want to take a quick minute to thank Extivia. You know, granted, I'm full-time here. I'm a virtual DBA. I'm in on systems every day, working on them. We're here to monitor, support your database solutions. We do this while we meet your processors. We have processes, excuse me. We have a business intelligence group that's here at Extivia to help us with all of your business intelligence needs. You can see some of the other bullet points that are on here. Before we kind of jump into the last slide, which has got some more contact information in it, I want to thank you for coming to the webinar today. If you have any questions, please feel free to stick around as long as they let me sit on here. If you don't have the opportunity to get those questions, my email address is chris@extivia.com, or not Chris, excuse me, C-Shaw, S-H-A-W, at Extivia, spelled Xtivia.com. And I appreciate you attending the webinar. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them inside the inbox. And then the last screen up here today is another way to get a hold of us if you'd like to.
Chris, thank you. Good job. I'm sure the audience appreciates it. And actually, Marcos says thank you and asks if we can deliver the slides. Those slides will be available, I would say, in the next 24 hours on the website. If you come back to our website and go to the SQL Server Tune Up page under webinars, there is a registration that you'll need to go through just like you did when you signed up. But on that page will be a recorded video of the webinar as well as the slides from today's presentation. I want to apologize too. I referred at the beginning of this webinar as the SQL Server maintenance plan. Obviously, this webinar is the SQL Server Tune Up, but I will use that to highlight that just a few months ago we did have a SQL Server maintenance plan webinar. If you're looking for more information, you're obviously welcome to go back, and that will be under our webinars section on the website as well. So, Chris, again, thank you, and attendees, feel free to contact us at the information below if you have further questions or if you need support with your databases.
Thank you, Ray. And like I mentioned, I'm open for, you know, the questions, the Twitter, the whole 9 yards. It's a great time.
Great. Thank you, Chris.